Hello, welcome to the Dropbox API tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to see a few different methods that are available to us in the Dropbox API that allow us to interact with files and folders and manipulate them. My name is Christian. I'll be your instructor for this course, and I'm sure you're wondering what we're going to do and what you'll need to know, so let's jump right in here. As far as what you want to know, it's good to know HTML and JavaScript, but it's not necessary, really. A lot of these methods we're looking at will be available for other languages, such as Python, for example. They just might be a little bit different syntax, but the overarching principles will remain the same. So as long as you're wanting to learn about the Dropbox API, even if you don't use the JavaScript SDK, which we're going to use, I think you'll find this useful. As for what you'll learn, we'll go over getting some files, getting the thumbnails for those files, and moving those files around. Now, I want to mention again, there are many more options available in the Dropbox API, many different methods that you can use to manipulate files and folders. But these are the ones we're going to go over, and hopefully that'll give you a good basis for how the API generally works. Additionally, we'll use some array methods that maybe you've never seen before, or maybe you need some clarification on how they work. We'll use some ES6 features, such as arrow functions. And we'll learn how to use async await, which is a fairly new way of dealing with asynchronous data and is perfect for our use case. As for what we're building specifically, well, take a look here, and you'll see that we have a file organizer 3000, as I've affectionately named it. We have a path where we can search for files or folders, and we have them listed out here with thumbnails. At the end of this lesson, we'll be able to organize every file in any given folder using the path here. And once we hit organize, it'll move those files into different folders based on their date modified. So that's the app we're going to build. Let's jump right in. Before we start coding out the app, I'd like to go over the developer documentation real quick. So if you want to click right here on the slide or just go to dropbox.com/developers, you should see something like this. It'll show you a dashboard of sorts. And if you go over to My Apps on the left-hand side, you should see a blank page because most likely you don't have any apps yet. And then you can click on Create App up at the top right. That'll get an app started for you. Now, before I go further, I should mention you don't need to do this to take this course. Just going to give you some brief information on how to set up an app so that when you do set up an app, you can be familiar with it, and it'll help you know how I set up this app. So first it's going to ask you which API you want to use. For this app, we're using the regular Dropbox API. If you wanted to support teams for Dropbox, so multiple people collaborating within Dropbox, then you might select Dropbox Business API, but most likely you're going to go with the regular API. Next, we need to choose if we're going to use just one folder for our app inside the user's Dropbox account, or if we need access to the user's entire Dropbox account. For this app, I went ahead and chose app folder, although in reality, if we were actually building this app, we would probably want to choose full Dropbox because this app is essentially going to organize a user's files, and that would require access to their files. Lastly, we want to pick a name for our app. If it's taken already, then it'll tell you that, and you can pick a new one. And once you're done, go ahead and click Create App. Okay, great. So now that should take you to a settings screen, and we'll quickly go through these. First, we have our status, which will currently be in development. When you're ready, you can go ahead and apply for production so that it can be reviewed by the Dropbox team. Currently, you are also only the user that can access this, and if you want to enable additional users, you can click here. Now, that still has a limit on it since it's a development app, and if you want to enable more users, then you would want to apply for production. Here we have the permission type that we just chose in step 2 when we first set up our app. That's app folder. We're only wanting access to one folder in the user's Dropbox account. We don't want access to their entire Dropbox account. And then we have our app folder name. Now this is by default going to be the same name as our app itself, but if you wanted to change the name of just that folder, your app name would remain the same, just the folder in the Dropbox user's account would change, then you can change it here. Next, we have the app key and secret. Now, in this tutorial, we're not going to use these, but in a real-life app, you probably would. App keys and secrets are good for when you need to do authorization, which is actually the next section here. We can choose where we want to redirect the user once they have been authorized. Allow implicit grant, I'm not going to really go into. If you hover over the I, when you actually go to the page, you can see a little more detail. You should probably leave it as is if you're building a client-side app, which you probably are. And generate access token is where you can get your own token to work with. This is something I've already done and that we'll use in our app, although I should note that the token I'm using will be expired by the time you're viewing this. So you may want to go ahead and do this and plug that in to Scrimba or your own code base, wherever, in order to actually play with some files. But this is basically going to skip the authorization setup and just give you a quick way to authorize Dropbox to check out the folders and files. Next, we have options for what are called choosers and savers, and they look like this. Basically just little buttons that Dropbox has already created for you, so that if you need to do something simple, like get some files, or maybe you just need to save a file to their account, then instead of building an entire app, you may just want to use a chooser or a saver. And if you do decide to use one of those, this is where you would put your web address so that Dropbox knows that host is okay to use a chooser or saver. Next, we have webhooks. Basically, it's the idea that once I do something here, I want to trigger an action there. Once I do something with Dropbox, I want to trigger an action with Gmail or something similar. Lastly, if you are done with this app, maybe you don't need it anymore, you can go ahead and delete it here. Just be warned, this is an irreversible action, so be careful. The next page we have is the branding page. These options are rather obvious. Lastly, we have the Analytics tab. This naturally shows nothing because we haven't done anything yet, but after a while you should see some stuff here. Real quick, before we go on to coding our app, I want to mention the JavaScript SDK documentation. You can click on this link to go there. It looks something like this. Basically, it's a list of all the different methods that are available. In this app, we're only going to use a few different methods, so it's really not going to give you a good idea of everything Dropbox can do. So go to the documentation, check out all the different methods you can use. Even if you're not going to use the JavaScript SDK in your app, maybe you're coding in Python or something else, this will be helpful because all these methods are the same or very similar to what you might use in another language. Once again, you can head over to dropbox.com/developers when you're ready to set up an account. Until then, let's go ahead and start the tutorial. Let's begin by importing the Dropbox SDK. One thing you need to make sure of is to surround Dropbox with curly braces because this is a named import or export. And once we do that, we can go ahead and use it to create a class, or rather instantiate a class and assign it to a variable. We'll call that DBX for Dropbox. And here we're just going to say new and then Dropbox with parentheses, and we're going to pass in an object to this function, which is creating a class for us that, once again, we're assigning to DBX. Now, that object is going to take two properties. One is going to be an access token, and the other is going to be a fetch library. Now, there are different fetch libraries you can use, in which case you'd put whatever fetch library here. But if you just want to use the native window fetch library, then you can just put fetch, and that uses the ES6 feature of simply assuming that the property and the variable are the same, which they are. For the access token, you'll want to go ahead and use your own, because by the time you view this, the access token I'm going to put right here is not going to be valid any longer. So go ahead and go to dropbox.com/developers. I'll go ahead and paste that link up here and set up your account to get your own token. And once you do that, you can replace the token here in whatever lesson you want to play around with. If you don't really want to play around with the code, of course, you don't have to do this. Everything will still work. It's not absolutely necessary, but part of the beauty of Scrimba and having lessons on here is that you can play around with the code, and you're not going to be able to do that unless you change out this access token. So I do encourage doing that, but either way, we've imported our Dropbox SDK, and we're now ready to use this DBX variable. So far, all we've done is instantiate our class. In order to see what methods are available on that class, you can go to the documentation here. We're just going to go ahead and use as our first method something called files list folder, which will essentially take the folder and list out the files inside that folder. So this takes a lot of different options on the object that we pass in, but we're just going to use for now the path. Now, to specify the root path, we actually pass an empty string, not a slash. And I should note the root path here is going to be the root of our app folder, not the user's Dropbox account. And this is because when I set up my developer app, I chose that option. You can set it to the user's Dropbox account, but I set mine to the app folder. So the root will actually be the root of the app folder, not the Dropbox account. Okay, now what's that going to do for us? That's going to return a promise. And all I want to do for now is go ahead and see what we're getting back. Let's hit save. Okay, it worked. We got back, it looks like an object with an entries property, and that value of that entries property is an array of different objects, and each object seems to represent either a folder or a file. So you'll see here this first one we have is a folder named other stuff. We have another folder here named 2018, another folder here named 2019. Looks like we've got a bunch of files in there, and you can see that we have a lot of data on each of these files. So in the next lesson, we'll go ahead and render these to the browser so that we're looking at it in a pretty way that's nice to see instead of in the console. But before we move on, I need to note real quick, before you go off and use this new files list folder method you've learned, you need to know this might not be all the files in the account or whatever the path is that we're trying to get them from. There might be more files, and there is a way, and we're going to learn later on how to use this, to get more files. It's called files list folder continue. There's a different method that Dropbox provides to us. So I just need to make that note real quick. We'll learn how to get more files later on. For now, we're just learning how to get that first response, however many files Dropbox is willing to give us. And in the next lesson, once again, we'll learn how to render those files to the browser. As it is now, our application only logs the result that we're getting back from Dropbox. That's fun and all, but let's see if we can render things to the browser. I know this tutorial is more about Dropbox, but I thought it might be useful to see how we're making things happen in the DOM. First of all, we need to declare an element to interact with. Here I'm declaring a variable called FileListElem for element, and using document.querySelector to select an element with the class of JSFileList. I like to put JS at the beginning of my class names just to know that I'm dealing with JavaScript, so I don't accidentally mess with them when I'm just dealing with HTML or CSS. I'm going to go ahead and do a little refactoring here to set up our app. What I've just done is declare a state variable that will hold our state. Right now it's just one files property, which is an empty array. I've moved our call to the files list folder endpoint into an init function, which we can call at the end after declaring our other functions. I've declared an update files function, which will take some files and update the state accordingly so that we keep all our old files that were in state as well as update it with the new ones. And inside that, we're also calling our render files function, which we'll fill in now. Inside render files, we'll first need to get our element so that we can place some HTML in there. Now, there are two things I want to do with the files here. First, I want to sort them. Then, I want to map over them, and for every one of them, create an li element so that we can see the list. Let's sort alphabetically, and let's go ahead and put the folders on top. Okay, real quick, I'll go over what we're doing here. On this line, we're comparing the .tag property of each item. If you'll recall what we logged to the console, every item in the array is going to have a .tag property that is either a folder or file. What we're basically saying here is, are either one of these items a folder? If so, we're going to need to prioritize the folder. Next, we're checking, are they the same? If they're both folders, or if they're both files, we don't need to do anything with them, except for organize them alphabetically, which we do here. But if one of them is a folder and one of them is a file, we're going to check which one is a folder. If it's the first one, we return -1 to say that it should come first, and if it's the second one, we return +1 to say that it should come second. In this way, we're sorting all our folders on top, and we're sorting everything alphabetically. Next, we turn to our .map method, which is going to loop through every item in the array and return an array. The map method of an array accepts a function. The first argument is each item in that array, in our case, a file or folder. In fact, let's go ahead and check what type this is. We'll say const type equals file, and then if you'll recall, the .tag property is what stores whether it's a file or a folder. Then we just want to return our actual HTML. I'm going to go ahead and use backticks to create a template literal. Inside this template literal, whatever I put will be what's returned. It will take it literally, hence the name. So let's return an li element. And what we want to see ultimately in the browser is the name of the file. If we were to look at our console again and see what is being returned from Dropbox, we'll see that there's a .name property on every file. So we'll put that in there. I also want to go ahead and do some styling real quick. I've already declared a class of dbxListItem for each individual item in the list. And then I also want to put the type that we just declared above so we know if it's a file or a folder. Okay, now before that's actually going to do anything, we do need to replace our console.log up here so that instead of logging it, we're actually calling all this logic. And to do that, we will call update files with the files that we get back from Dropbox. Once again, if you were to look at that console that we logged earlier in the last lesson, you'll see that there's a .entries property on that object which holds the array of files. So now we have our init function calling our update files function, which calls our render files function, which will ultimately render something to the DOM. However, if we were to call this right now, we would see a bunch of commas in between every li element. Let me go ahead and hit save to show you what I mean. As you can see, we've successfully logged the items of the array. However, we are seeing commas in between every item. And that's simply because we're not returning a string here to our .inner HTML, we're returning an array. We don't really want to do that, we want to return a string. So let's take this array, let's call the .join method, which will join every element in the array into one string, and inside we can pass what kind of separator we want to use. In our case, we don't want a separator, we just want one long string. So we'll pass an empty string, we'll hit save again, and now, voila! We can see all of our items. We can see that our folder is up on top, other stuff, and we can see that they are ordered alphabetically. Now that's not really easy to tell that this is a folder, so in the next lesson, we'll go ahead and add some thumbnails. Right now, our app is working and we're displaying our files, but it doesn't look great yet. What we'd like to do in this lesson is go ahead and add some thumbnails. Now this lesson is going to concentrate on simply rendering those thumbnails, and the next lesson we'll see how we can get the actual thumbnails for each file from Dropbox. What we want to do here ultimately is in our render function, while we're mapping over each file, is check if that file has a thumbnail property, and if so, use it, and if not, go ahead and use a default. Now the first thing to keep in mind here is that folders do not have thumbnails. So essentially our first check is going to say, are we dealing with file? And if we are dealing with a file, then we can go ahead and use a thumbnail. If not, we'll just use a default folder thumbnail. Let's start by declaring a thumbnail variable. First, we have our check to see if it's a file. If it is, we want to go ahead and use the thumbnail property on the file, in other words, the actual thumbnail. And if not, we want to go ahead and use a default thumbnail. We're going to go ahead and check this with a ternary expression. In case you're not familiar with ternary expressions, they essentially take the form of if something, and if that's true, do something, and if it's not, do something else. Okay, so let's go ahead and write that out. What are we going to test? Well, first of all, we need to assign something to our thumbnail variable, and here's where our ternary expression starts. We're going to go ahead and check if there is a thumbnail property on our file. If there is, then we're going to go ahead and use that thumbnail, and if not, we'll use a default. Okay, now the thumbnail being returned by Dropbox is going to be a base64 image. Essentially, that's just one big long string that's a representation of an image. Instead of an actual file, it's a string that represents an image. How do we use that in HTML? Well, it looks something like this. The important part, I suppose, here is in the beginning. We're going to start with data : image, and then our type of image, and then base64, comma, and then our base64 string. This big long string is just a default file thumbnail in case we don't have a thumbnail available on our file. But if we do, we want to go ahead and use that thumbnail. Okay, so you'll see we're essentially starting with the same thing, except this file is going to be a JPEG. That is the default of the file format from Dropbox. Then we're using a template literal with an inserted variable to insert our base64 string. So this is going to be whatever base64 string Dropbox provides. Just to review one more time, we're assigning our thumbnail variable to either the actual thumbnail, if it exists, or a default thumbnail if it does not. For our folders, once again, folders don't have thumbnails, so we can simply use the default. Okay, once again, that's just a big long string. It's a folder thumbnail, as we'll see in just a moment. The last thing we need to do is actually insert the thumbnail in our HTML. So we're going to go ahead and use an image tag here. I'm going to put a class on the image because I've already set this up in my CSS just to make it look nice. And then, of course, we need to declare our source for our image tag. It is going to be thumbnail, which is the variable we have declared and assigned based on whether or not there is one and whether or not it's a file or a folder. Okay, let's save and see what happens. There we go. We've got our thumbnails. As you can see, we have a folder here, and the rest of them are files. Now, obviously, these are default thumbnails, and in the next lesson, we'll learn how we can get the actual thumbnails from Dropbox. In the last lesson, we learned how to render thumbnails with our files. In this lesson, we'll go ahead and learn how to get the actual thumbnails from Dropbox. If you look at the documentation, which I've linked at the top here, you'll find that there is a method available to us called files get thumbnail batch. And that function takes an argument, which is an object that has an entries property, which is an array of objects, each object having a path and an optional size. This is the basic format for the request we'll be making. Okay, so we're getting an array of files, and we want to turn that into an array of paths. So let's go ahead and do that now. We'll say const paths equals, what do we need to do to our array first? Well, first let's filter out all the folders, because folders don't have thumbnails. Here we're using the filter method on an array, and that takes a function, the first argument of which is the item in the array we're working on. And it simply returns true or false. If it returns true, we keep that item. If it returns false, we get rid of it. In this case, we're checking to see if the .tag property is equal to file, because if it is, it's file and we want to keep it. If it's not, we don't want to keep it. Now that we've filtered our array so that we only have files and no folders, we can go ahead and map over every item. And what we'll ultimately want to return for every item is this object down here. Okay, so we need to return that item, but how do we do that? Instead of just typing curly braces, we can actually surround those curly braces in parentheses to return a literal object. All right, so what is our path? Well, that's actually available on the file itself as path lower. If you'll recall, we originally started this app by making a call to files list folder, which gave us a list of folders and files, each of which had lots of information. And one of those pieces of information is path lower. For the size, you'll have to go ahead and look at the documentation to see what sizes are available. But for our uses, we want to go ahead and use 32 by 32. Okay, so instead of this array here, we will pass the paths array we just created. And that will return a promise. So let's go ahead and see what we get back simply by logging into the console. Before we can do that, however, there are a couple things we need to do. First off, if we look at our documentation, we'll find that this thumbnail batch call actually has a limit on it, so we can't get more than 25 at a time. It turns out this files list folder call also has an option for a limit, so this would be a good place to remedy that. Let's go ahead and put a limit of 20 for our demo purposes. And then, of course, we need to call our new function somewhere. Let's go ahead and call it in the update files function and make sure to pass in the files array. Okay, so when we initialize our app, we are making a call to files list folder to get the files and folders. Then we're calling update files, and then we are calling get thumbnails. Let's go ahead and save to see what happens. All right, looks like we got a success. If we look at the console, you'll see there's a lot of information there. But essentially, we're just getting an object with an entries property and an array of files and folders. Well, in this case, actually, just an array of files. All right, so now that we have our response back from Dropbox, we are ready to start working with it and assign our thumbnails to our files. Essentially, what we want to do is just create a thumbnail property on each file object that holds the thumbnail data. Now, this next part gets a little bit complicated, so I'm just going to go ahead and paste it out, and then we can walk through it step by step. First of all, we're going to make a copy of our current state.files array. We do that very easily with the ES6 spread operator. That's those three dots here at the beginning. That's essentially telling JavaScript to spread the items of the array into this new array. So we do that, and we call our new variable newStateFiles. Next, we want to loop through the res.entries array that we got back from Dropbox. That res.entries array is just going to be an array of objects. Each object has a lot of information on it, but one of the properties on the object is thumbnail, and that's the one we're interested in. We want to get the thumbnail of that object. So we're going to loop through each item in the array, and in order to know which item we need to update the thumbnail of, we first need to figure out where it is in the array. So we're declaring here a variable called index.update. That's going to figure out, okay, what item in our newStateFiles array, remember that's just a copy of our current state, which item do we need to put a thumbnail on? And the way we figure that out is using a method called findIndex. This is a method available on the array prototype, so any array you work with is going to have this findIndex method, and it's similar to the .filter method that we used earlier in that it's ultimately going to return either true or false. And what we're testing here is just to see if the path is the same. So if the path is the same, it's the same file, right? And if it's the same file, that's the one we want to update. So we pass an argument to the item we're going to be working on, and we just test to see if the path is the same. And if it is, that's the index that we want to use. So we plug that index in here, and we say, in our newStateFiles array, find this index and add the .thumbnail property to it and make it equal to whatever the thumbnail was that Dropbox returned for that file. And once we do all that for every single item in the array, we can finally assign state.files to our new array of files. And the only difference here is this array has thumbnails. That's the only difference between these two arrays. So we've added our thumbnails to our items in our array, and finally, we render them to the screen. Let's hit save and see what happens. All right, looks like everything is working. We've got our actual thumbnails next to each item. Everything seems to be working fine. You'll notice that at the top here we have a folder, and that does not have a thumbnail, which is normal, but every other file does. So everything was successful, and we're ready to move on. So far, we've introduced two API calls into our app. The first was FilesList folder, and the second, FilesGetThumbnailBatch. Both of these have returned promises using .then, which make working with asynchronous data a little easier. However, we're going to need to make some more calls in the future, and we'd like to move away from promises into a feature in ES6 called Async Await. The way Async Await works is simply we declare async before our function. So instead of just writing out the function, put the async keyword right before it. Now, inside of that function, we can use the await keyword. Let's go ahead and call our variable res, just like before. But this time, we'll put await before our function call. So const res equals await whatever our asynchronous call is. As long as that returns a promise, this should work. And we can get rid of our .then call and instead act like this is just a regular variable. Essentially, if you picture this function being a synchronous function, we're working with asynchronous data the same way. It's as if we were saying const res equals 1 plus 2, and then using it just like we normally would. Only this function is asynchronous, and by using async await, we are telling JavaScript to wait until this function is complete before moving on to the update files call, and then using this variable. Let's go ahead and do the same thing with our getThumbnails function. Again, we'll declare the async keyword before the function, and we will simplify here by assigning our data to a res variable. Once again, we can get rid of the .then call, and we can go ahead and use all the stuff we've done earlier in pretty much the same format, only now it's a lot cleaner. It just looks like we're dealing with synchronous data. We're assigning a variable res to whatever data we get back here, and as long as we include the await keyword before our asynchronous call, we should be good. Let's go ahead and save and see if this still works. Looks like everything still works. So that's how you use async await to simplify your code and make working with asynchronous data a little bit more manageable. We'll go ahead and continue to use async await in future lessons. We just learned how to render thumbnails after getting them from Dropbox. In order to get those thumbnails, we had to limit our first call to get files to only 25 at the very most, and we chose 20. However, there are more than 20 files in our folder. In this folder that we're using for our demo, there are actually 37 files. So what do we do if we want our thumbnails, but we still want to get all the files? Well, Dropbox has a way to do this. For the sake of demo purposes, let's go ahead and change this limit to 5. As you can see here, we're only getting 5 files. One of them is a folder. To show how we can resolve this, I'm going to take a look at an online tool that Dropbox provides, and I've linked it right here. They call it the API Explorer. If you go ahead and open up that link, you might see something like this. There are a bunch of methods listed on the left-hand side that you don't see in the slide here, but one of those methods is list folder. And you may recognize that name because we're using the JavaScript SDK equivalent right here, files list folder. Now, online, if you look at the tool, you'll be able to see the different options that are available, and you can enter a path, and you can enter a limit, for example, and then you can go ahead and submit that call to see what happens. If you do that, you might see a response that looks something like this. This should look somewhat familiar to us. We have our entries property, which is an array of files. However, there are two things we haven't looked at yet, and that's these last two properties, the cursor and has more. The cursor is essentially a very long string that keeps track of where we are in the process or in the folder. It's sort of like a you were here last time you made this call pointer. And the has more property tells us, are there more files to get? In this case, it looks like there are. So we can use the has more property to tell if we have more files to get, and we can use the cursor to actually get those files. And we would do that with another method that's similar to the one we already used. If we look at the API Explorer, it would be under list folder / continue. Now, the JavaScript SDK name will be a little bit different, but we'll go ahead and look at this for now. If you look at the online tool, you'll be able to enter the cursor right here in a box and submit a call. That will show you another object similar to what we've already seen. We have an entries property, which is an array of files. And you can do this over and over again until finally, at the very end, once there are no more files, you'll see has more equal to false. In other words, for every response we get from Dropbox, we want to check the has more property, and if it's true, use the cursor to get some more files, and then repeat that process until eventually has more will be false. And that's what we'll learn how to do in our next lesson. Our app is going to start by calling this init function. Inside of that function, we are getting some files and folders from Dropbox. We're limiting them to only 20 for the sake of getting thumbnails, and then we are rendering them. After we make this call, though, we want to check if there are more files. So let's check that has more property that we discussed in the last lesson. And if it's true, we will call a function called getMoreFiles, which we haven't set up yet, but let's just type it out for now. And into that function, we'll need to pass the cursor so it can use that to get more files. And in this case, since we'd like something to happen with those files right away, we'll also pass a callback. So this is going to be a callback function here that's going to receive more files from our getMoreFiles function. And what do we want to do with those files? Well, we want to do the same thing we did with our first set of files. We want to call update files. And remember that the entries property is where those files are stored. Once again, we're going to call a getMoreFiles function that we still need to create. We're going to pass in the cursor, and we're also going to pass in a callback function so that when more files are retrieved, those files can be passed into this function and we can update files. Okay, now when we're doing this, I'd like to show a loading message to the user so they know something's happening. Let's go ahead and store that in a variable here. Now that we have that variable, we can simply hide or show that element whenever we're loading or not loading. Okay, so we're showing our loading message. We're running our getMoreFiles function. we're hiding our loading message, and in case we don't actually have any more files, we'll skip that block altogether and we'll just make sure our loading message is hidden. Now this get more files function is obviously going to be asynchronous, so we need to make sure to put await here. And that keyword will work because this init function is asynchronous. If we didn't have this async keyword here, that await keyword and this await keyword would not work, but they do. So after our get more files function is complete, then we can continue with our code. Now we get to create our get more files function. Okay, the first thing we need to do is figure out what Dropbox method there is for us to call. If we look at the documentation, we'll find that there is a method very similar to files list folder called files list folder continue. And that method is going to take an object with a cursor property, which is going to be the cursor. Using object destructuring, we can actually shorten this to just say cursor, because it is assumed when we write it like this that the property name and the variable that is the value will be the same, which they are. We're getting our cursor value here, and so this is just a shorthand way of saying cursor is equal to cursor. After we do that, and keep in mind that's asynchronous, so we'll need to make sure this is an asynchronous function, and we'll check if there was a callback provided to this function, and if so, call it with our response. Now, as it is right now, we are only checking for more files one time, but obviously we need to do that until there are no more files to get. So once again, we'll check that has more property, and if there are more files to get, we'll just use recursion to call this same file again. This time, we'll pass in the cursor we got from our second call, and we'll pass in the same callback function. Okay, so get more files will run. It will check if there are more files using the cursor. It will make a callback, and if there are more files still, even after that call that we just made, then it will call this same function yet again. And it will keep doing that until has more is false, in which case it will skip this call right here. One more thing we need to remember is this await keyword. It's easy to forget, but do recall that this get more files function is asynchronous. So our files list folder continue function is asynchronous, and our get more files function is asynchronous, so they both need this await keyword. Okay, let's save and see what happens. You may have noticed that the first response was updated shortly after with some new files, and if you scroll down, you'll see we have a lot more than 20 right now. Looks like it's working. So we're making our initial call to get some files. We're updating our browser. Then we're checking if there are more files. If so, we'll show a loading message, and we will wait for our get more files function, which will get more files, call the callback, and once again check if there are still more files, and if so, repeat this loop until eventually there are no more files, at which point this code will continue because of our await keyword and hide the loading message. We've done some pretty cool things in our app already. However, one thing that would be nice is if we weren't restricted to just the root path all the time. Let's go ahead and build that out now. If we look at our app currently, you'll see I've made some changes with the CSS and HTML, but the important thing for this lesson is this folder path input up here. Ideally, we'd like to let the user enter some sort of path in here and go to it. In our app right now, we only have one folder, other stuff, so it'd be nice if the user could say, hey, I want to go to other stuff, and hit enter or hit the button and go to the path. Right now it's not working, it's just refreshing the page. So let's go ahead and build out that logic. First off, we'll need to declare a couple new variables to reference some HTML elements and get the data from that form. So we've declared one element for the form and one element for the input. Why do we need both? Well, for the form, we want to use that to listen to the submit event. That's how we'll know when the user has actually changed anything about the path. So we'll add an event listener, and we'll listen for that submit event, which will give us an event. I've labeled that as E here. And the first thing we need to do is prevent the default behavior of forms, because that will refresh the page, and we don't want that. Next, we need to get the value for the input. Remember that is at root path input. That's declared up here. And we can get the value simply by saying .value. However, in Dropbox, the root path is expressed with an empty string and not a slash, which a lot of people are used to. So I do real quick want to do a check and see if they entered it equal to a slash. If so, let's go ahead and use an empty string. If not, we can go ahead and use that value. Also, people sometimes make mistakes with capitalization and such, so let's turn this into a lowercase string. That way we're always dealing with lowercase. Now, we're not actually doing anything with this variable yet, so let's think about what we might need to do. It would be nice if this root path was available throughout our app. We may need to use it elsewhere. So let's actually go ahead and put that on state. It might change over time, so that seems like a good place to put it. Okay, so now we are assigning the root path property of the state object to whatever the root path is that the user enters when they submit the form. What else do we need to do? Well, we don't want to show the folders and files from the old path, so let's go ahead and clear those out. Also, there is one quick thing I want to do with the HTML. All I'm doing here is referencing that loading element that you see sometimes when the app first starts, and I'm removing the hidden class to show the user that it is loading. And, well, if we think about it, we're basically starting over in our app. When we first pull up the app, it's loading files, and then once it's done loading, that loading message is hidden, and we can start using it. We want to do the same thing here every time a user changes the path, so let's just go ahead and call our init function right now. That will basically start our app over. It will get this files list folder called, and it will search for whatever the path is, except we don't want an empty string here. We want whatever our root path is that the user entered. Okay, so anytime the user submits that root path field, it will get the value, it will store it on our state, it will show a hidden message, and it will reinitialize our app. Oh, I just realized I forgot to put parentheses after our to lowercase method. Sorry about that. Now let's go ahead and save and see what happens. Okay, we only have one folder here, other stuff. So I guess that's the folder we're going to be testing. Here we go. And it works. I can look in my Dropbox account and confirm this is indeed the contents of the other stuff folder. So everything is working as it should. In the next lesson, we'll learn how to make this organize button work to magically move our files into their respective folders. At last, we reached the main function of our app, the ability to organize our files into folders based on the date modified. Let's get started. First, we'll need to get a reference to the button element. We'll go ahead and call it organize button. Then we need to listen for a click on that button. Since organizing our files will be asynchronous, let's show some sort of message to our user to indicate that something's happening. First, we'll disable the button, and then after we disable the button, let's show a message. Then we'll go ahead and carry out our organize operation. That is asynchronous, so we'll need to make sure this is an asynchronous function, and we'll need to wait for that to complete. Once it completes, we can re-enable our button. And in order to restore the previous text, we'll need to grab that first. Now that we have a variable to reference the text before it was clicked, we can restore that. Okay, now we're ready to create our move files to dated folders function. First off, let's establish which Dropbox method we need to use in order to move files around. For this function, we will use files move batch v2. They have a version 2 of this function. That's what we'll use here. That takes an object as an argument with a, you guessed it, entries property. And that entries property is an array of objects, each object having a from path and a to path. So where are we moving it from and where are we moving it to? Now, of course, we won't hard code this array. We will generate it. So let's call that array entries so that we can simplify it using object destructuring. And let's create that entries array up here. That will be based on our state.files array. So we're taking whatever files are in our state currently, and we're going to perform two operations on them. First of all, we're going to filter out the folders, just like we did with our get thumbnails method. Then we're going to map over every file. And what we ultimately want to return is an object with a from path and a to path. Now the from path is going to be pretty simple. That's just file.path lower. That's available on the metadata we got from our very first Dropbox call. The to path is what we'll need to build based on the date. Now the file does have a property on it called client modified, and that will tell us the date that it's last modified, so that's already taken care of for us. Just so you know, there also is a server modified property, but for this case we will use client modified. And it's put in such a format that we can actually use it with the JavaScript date constructor. So we will do that in order to have this date variable, something that we'll be able to work with in order to get the year and the month and whatever other information we need from this date. Okay, so essentially what we're going to use to build our path is a template literal with 4 different variables. We have our root, then our year, then our month, and then the file name. So for the root, that's found on our state object, so state.rootPath. Our year is going to come from that date variable we just created, and you can get that by typing in here get full year. Our month is going to be a little bit weirder than a year. It's going to be get UTC month, and also the month number is 1 behind what you might think it would be, so January is actually 0. So we add 1 to whatever the month says it is in order to make it more reasonable. And then finally we have the file name. All right, that's all for this lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to finish building our move files function, and we're actually going to see our app do its magic. In the previous lesson, we set up this entries array, and we passed it into the property of entries on our object, which we passed into files move batch v2 from Dropbox, which is going to move our files around. Now we need to handle whatever Dropbox does. So what is it going to do, and what's it going to return to us? Well, it could return one of two things. It may be an object saying that the job is done, which will say success, or it may be an object with an asynchronous job ID. Now, if we get back an asynchronous job ID, then we know that it's still working. So here, I'm just pulling out that property from our response object. And if that property exists, whatever is inside of this if block will run. And so what do we need to do in here? Well, we need to check on that job. Now, how do we do that? Dropbox actually provides a similar method to us. And that method is called files move batch check v2. And in that method, we pass in an object with our asynchronous job ID. Okay, so we'll want to make sure that we're waiting for this to complete. And you'll notice I use the let keyword there because we're going to reassign that res variable. And we're going to do that right here because we want to reassign it to a new value when we check on the current status. But we don't want to do that one time. We actually need to keep doing that until we get a response saying that that job is done. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to need to set up a loop. Here we've set up a do-while loop. With a do-while loop, the logic inside the brackets will run at least one time, regardless of our logic here inside of the parentheses. And that's what we want. We need to make sure if we're getting an asynchronous job ID back from our response that we're following up on that at least one time. Then it will keep doing that as long as this logic inside our while parentheses is true. And here we're simply checking the .tag property of our response to see if it's still in progress. As long as that .tag property is in progress, our job is still working, so we need to keep checking. So we will loop over this continually until eventually that .tag property is something else, maybe success, maybe failure. Either way, we know the job is finally done. Now that's it for our move files function, but once that's all done, we want to change the UI a bit. So let's go back up to our button. Here we are waiting for our function to be done, and after it's done, we are re-enabling our button, and we are showing the original message of our button, but we also need to reinitialize our state, just like we did with our root path form. So when someone changes the path, we need to clear out the current state of files, show the new files the new path, and we need to show that loading message while we're doing that. And then we need to reinitialize our whole app. So we want to do the exact same logic, and because of that, I'm going to refactor here a little bit. Okay, all I've done here is move that logic into its own function called reset, and we're calling that same function with our root path form and our organize button. Okay, so that's pretty much everything we need to do. Let's save and see what happens. All right, the moment of truth, here we go. Now, as you can see, we're getting responses back from Dropbox. This is our loop running. It is logging out whatever response we get, and you'll see that .tag property is still in progress. So that loop needs to keep running, and our button is disabled and it says working. So we are waiting for this job to complete. And there we go. You can see we have a .tag property with complete, and if you look at our file structure, well, there are no files. We just have folders now. We have a 2018 folder and a 2019 folder. We still have our other stuff folder, so that hasn't moved, which is good. Let's go ahead and check out the contents of these new folders. 2018, okay, that has a 12 folder, so that's December. Let's go into that and see what we have. And there we go. Here are our files. Looks like all the files moved successfully into our folder, and we've set it up so that there's also a 2019 folder with January. So it looks like our files were spanning across 2 different months, and they've all been moved successfully. Our app officially works. Awesome. Now, there is one thing I want to mention real quick, and that is error handling. It's not something we've really done in any of our methods thus far, but it's definitely advised in the real world. And with async await, it's actually not too hard. You simply surround your code with a try-catch block. So we're going to try whatever is in these brackets, and if it is successful, then great. It just carries on and does its thing. Otherwise, if there's any kind of error, it can go ahead and pass that error into a catch block. And we can do whatever we want here. We could log it to the console, or we could show something to the user. The latter would be preferable because we want the user to know something went wrong. And that's the whole purpose of error handling, so that we can actually do something with these errors and it can be a better user experience. So when you build your own app, it's definitely advisable to do some kind of error handling. And once again, you can wrap stuff in a try-catch block to at least form the basic foundation of error handling. So that's just a quick preview into how you might handle some errors just in case something goes wrong with Dropbox or there's a network failure or whatever it may be. And with that, we're just going to leave our app as is. It's basically complete. Of course, you can add more features. You're definitely encouraged to do so. But for the sake of our demo, what you see is officially our app. Congratulations! You've made it to the end of the Dropbox API course. Thanks so much for taking the time to look at this. I hope it was inspiring. Just to recap what we've learned so far, we learned how to get files and display those in the browser. We learned how to get thumbnails for those files and display those as well. And we learned how to move files around in the actual Dropbox account. As for the JavaScript side of things, we learned some array methods such as sorting and filtering. We saw some ES6 features being used like arrow functions. And we learned async await, which is a great way to deal with asynchronous data in general, especially when you're working with APIs like this one. Once again, my name is Christian. It was a lot of fun putting this course together. I hope that you will head over to dropbox.com/developers and set up your own app, and then go and look at the documentation to find some more methods that you can use and some more cool things that you can do with Dropbox. That's the end of our Dropbox course. I just want to challenge you one more time. Go ahead, build something cool, and share it with the world.